Right now, as kinetic strikes target major energy hubs in the Middle East, and central banks completely freeze up over sticky inflation.
Yeah, the whole system is just under immense pressure right now.
Exactly. And meanwhile, a company backed by NVIDIA is actively preparing to launch digital asset mining rigs into orbit.
Which, I mean, sounds like science fiction until you look at the underlying data.
Right. Why are they doing this?
Yeah.
Because the financial plumbing here on Earth is literally breaking down under the stress of a physically fractured supply chain. Welcome to the week that was.
Glad to be here for this one. It's a huge topic.
It really is. So if you are listening to this right now, consider this conversation your shortcut to kind of cutting through the headline panic and becoming genuinely well-informed.
Because there is a lot of panic out there.
Oh, absolutely. We are looking at an extraordinary collision today. It's a massive geopolitical conflict, global energy shocks, paralyzed monetary policy, and a real-time stress test of digital assets versus traditional safe havens.
And to really understand this collision, we have to synthesize a massive stack of intelligence. We're looking at geopolitical situation reports, raw financial market data, on-chain analytics.
SEC regulatory filings, too.
Yeah, those two. The mission here isn't just to recite what happened. I mean, the mission is to connect the dots. We really need to understand the underlying mechanics of why a blocked shipping lane on one side of the world forces an institutional hedge fund to, liquidate their gold positions on the other.
Right. And why digital assets are behaving fundamentally differently than any legacy model predicted. Okay, let's unpack this.
Sounds good. Let's get into it.
But first, let's set some ground rules for you listening before we get into the really heavy details.
Always a good idea with this kind of material.
Yeah. So when we discuss the strikes involving the U.S. administration, allied forces, or Iranian leadership, our goal is absolutely not to take a political side or weigh in on the geopolitics.
Right. We are strictly looking at the intelligence reports and market data as impartial analysts.
Exactly. We just want to understand how this kinetic conflict is physically breaking global financial models. So we really have to start with the physical world.
You have to. You cannot understand the chaos in the financial markets without understanding that the physical supply chain has been severely compromised.
Yeah. The escalation of Operation Epic Fury fundamentally changed the paradigm.
It really did. We saw the Israel Defense Forces execute decapitation strikes on top Iranian leadership. The intelligence actually confirms the elimination of key figures, including Ali Larijani and Esmail Khatib.
Which is huge. And the consequence of strikes at that specific tier of leadership is that Supreme Leader Mujtaba Khamenei reportedly evacuated to Russia for medical treatment.
Right.
Which feels like it just completely shatters whatever unwritten rules of engagement were holding the region together. Like when you target the absolute apex of a state's security apparatus, diplomatic deterrence just vanishes.
It evaporates entirely, and the market just wasn't prepared for the shape of the retaliation.
They assumed a proportional response.
Exactly, a proportional military response. But instead, we saw a deliberate expansion of the kinetic threat radius. They targeted non-combatant global energy hubs.
Right. The retaliation hit the Shah gas field in the UAE, the world's largest LNG plant in Qatar, and massive oil refineries in Kuwait.
And it didn't even stop in the Persian Gulf. They also targeted a joint U.S. and U.K. military base on Diego Garcia.
And for you listening, if you look at a map, Diego Garcia is 4,000 kilometers away from the Iranian mainland.
Yeah, it's incredibly far.
Striking that base proves their ballistic missile capabilities reach significantly further than their previously acknowledged limits.
Oh, for sure. It changes the entire threat assessment.
And on the flip side of this, Allied forces struck the Natanz nuclear facility in Iran using GBU-57 bunker buster munitions.
The massive payload ones.
Yeah. Now, the IAEA confirmed there were no radiation leaks, which is, a huge relief, but the sheer payload of the weaponry being deployed there is staggering.
The deployment of those munitions signals a transition. We're moving from asymmetric proxy skirmishes to full-scale direct infrastructural warfare.
Yeah.
But the most immediate economic casualty of this expanded threat radius isn't really the facilities themselves.
It's the shipping, right?
Exactly. It's the maritime logistics connecting them to the world. The Strait of Hormuz is functionally blockaded right now. Transit volumes are down 95%.
95%. That number is just... It's hard to wrap your head around. 95% of the traffic in one of the world's most critical energy arteries just stopped.
Because Tehran selectively imposed a traffic control system, and the global insurance markets reacted instantly to that.
Right.
Maritime insurance premiums have surged to 5% of a vessel's hull value.
Okay, let me do the math on that for a second, because that is where the theoretical meets the physical reality.
Go for it.
If a shipping company is operating a standard $100 million oil tanker, a 5% premium is a $5 million tax just to sail through the water.
Yeah, it's astronomical.
That single tax makes most commercial freight operations mathematically unfeasible. It is basically a sudden, massive blood clot in the global economy.
That's a great way to put it.
But how does a physical bottleneck like that so instantly break the mathematical models that Wall Street relies on to price risk?
Well, Wall Street models are built on historical correlations, right? And theoretical risk premiums. They run on spreadsheets that assume an orderly world.
They assume everything eventually regresses to the mean.
Right. The math says if supply drops by X amount, the price rises by Y, demand naturally cools off, and the system balances itself out. But an algorithm simply cannot price in the total collapse of diplomatic deterrence.
Because it's a binary outcome.
Exactly. When you shift from a theoretical risk of supply disruption to the physical destruction of the infrastructure, when the LNG plant is actively burning and the ships literally cannot afford the insurance to move, the model completely fails. You just cannot hedge against a physically missing supply chain with a financial derivative.
Which bridges us perfectly to the economic fallout, because the central banks are the ones left holding the bag here.
Oh, they are trapped in an impossible situation right now.
Yeah. Crude oil has surged 40%, breaking past $118 a barrel. And that isn't just bad for commuters. It's a direct, unavoidable tax on every single tier of the global manufacturing and transportation economy.
It creates a textbook stagflationary trap. Growth is stalling because of the geopolitical shock, but prices are skyrocketing because the physical energy supply is choked off.
We actually saw this play out with the Federal Reserve in recent reporting.
Yeah.
The Producer Price Index, the PPI, came in incredibly hot.
Obliterated the consensus forecasts.
Completely obliterated them. That forced the Federal Open Market Committee to hold interest rates steady, and they are now signaling 0 rate cuts for the foreseeable future.
Right.
But at the exact same time they're trying to tighten the belt, the U.S. Pentagon requested $200 billion in unbudgeted emergency funds to sustain the military operations.
And that is on top of the $1.5 billion a day they're already spending. What's fascinating here is that this is the core mechanism of the fiat paradox. Let's break down how that actually works behind the scenes.
Yeah, please do.
That $200 billion doesn't exist in a vault at the Treasury, right? To fund the unbudgeted military request, the U.S. Treasury has to issue new sovereign debt. They have to sell bonds.
Okay.
But because inflation is running hot and foreign demand for U.S. bonds is weakening, the open market isn't going to absorb all that new debt at favorable rates.
So the Federal Reserve has to step in as the buyer of last resort.
Exactly.
They essentially print the currency to buy the Treasury's bonds, thereby monetizing the debt. They are actively debasing the purchasing power of the existing currency supply just to fund a kinetic conflict.
Precisely. And while they are monetizing debt out the back door, they're attempting to artificially suppress the consumer price index out the front door.
Right, with the oil releases. Yeah. The U.S. Treasury actually authorized a 30-day sanctions waiver to release 140 million barrels of Iranian oil into the global market, purely to cool down the CPI metrics.
It's so contradictory. And we also saw President Trump threaten the destruction of the South Pars gas field, though he later indicated preparations to actually wind down military involvement.
That's a lot of mixed signals.
It is. And I have to push back on the core logic the Federal Reserve is using here.
How so?
Well, if inflation is being driven by blown-up refineries, blocked straits, and soaring maritime insurance, how does holding interest rates high actually fix the problem?
It doesn't.
Raising the cost of capital feels like trying to put out a house fire by turning off the Wi-Fi. You are punishing the homeowner, but you aren't actually extinguishing the flames.
That analogy hits the nail on the head because it exposes systemic fiat fragility.
Right.
The legacy financial system lacks any organic mechanism to handle a physical supply shock. Raising interest rates destroys consumer demand by making borrowing expensive, but a higher interest rate doesn't build a new pipeline. No, it doesn't.
It doesn't extinguish an oil fire. It doesn't lower the hull insurance on a tanker. So the system results to artificial interventions, like issuing those contradictory sanctions waivers just to manipulate the inflation data.
To make the numbers look better on paper.
Exactly. The result is that while nominal interest rates look high, real inflation is accelerating even faster. Anyone holding traditional fiat currency or sovereign debt is currently experiencing negative real yields.
So if fiat is structurally manipulated to hide inflation during a crisis, we have to look at how the traditional safe havens and digital assets performed during this exact real-time stress test.
The divergence we're seeing is just wild.
Let's look at gold first. Gold suffered its worst week since 1982, dropping 10.5%.
Which contradicts every traditional finance textbook out there.
Right. Why did the ultimate safe haven collapse during a massive geopolitical war?
To understand the collapse in gold, we really have to look at the mechanics of centralized clearinghouses. I mean, people didn't just suddenly decide gold was worthless.
Right. It wasn't a narrative shift.
No, not at all. The drop was triggered by centralized margin calls in the crude oil market.
Okay, walk us through that. How does a margin call in oil force a sell-off in gold?
Imagine you're a massive institutional fund. You have a complex portfolio, and part of your strategy involves shorting crude oil, betting the price will stay stable or go down.
Okay, makes sense.
Suddenly, the Strait of Hormuz is blockaded and oil goes parabolic to $118 a barrel. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange, the centralized entity managing those trades, immediately hikes margin requirements.
Because the volatility is out of control.
Exactly. They look at your losing oil position and say, you need to post hundreds of millions of dollars in cash today to keep this trade open, or we will liquidate you.
And if you don't have that cash just sitting around, you have to sell something else to raise it quickly.
Exactly the problem. You can't sell your illiquid real estate overnight. So you sell your most liquid winning asset.
Which was gold.
For most traditional funds, that was gold. The centralized leverage in the oil market created a liquidity vortex that basically dragged gold down with it, entirely against its fundamental narrative.
Wow. But then you look at Bitcoin. During this exact same liquidity vortex, Bitcoin initially surged past $74,000 in a massive short squeeze, hitting over $76,000.
Yeah, a massive spike.
It eventually settled back into a consolidation range between roughly $68,800 and $70,600. But despite the geopolitical volatility, Bitcoin remained fundamentally flat and incredibly resilient compared to the 10% collapse in gold.
And the mechanical reason for Bitcoin's resilience in this specific scenario is profound.
Because of the ledger.
Yes. Bitcoin settles natively on a decentralized ledger. It operates entirely outside of legacy clearinghouses. It is completely insulated from the centralized exchange margin interventions that crushed gold.
It makes me think of the difference between playing at a casino versus a private game.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Traditional markets are like playing blackjack at a casino, where the the centralized clearinghouses can suddenly change the margin rules in the middle of a hand. Yeah. You might have a winning strategy, but if the house demands more chips and you don't have them, they force you to fold.
Right. You have no control.
But Bitcoin, assuming you hold it in self-custody, is like a peer-to-peer poker game in the back room. You hold your own chips. As long as you aren't using borrowed leverage, no one can tap you on the shoulder and force you out of the game to cover someone else's losses.
That structural decoupling is exactly why we saw such a unique on-chain signature this week. The analytics show we are in the middle of a massive generational wealth transfer.
Really? What are the metrics saying?
Well, the exchange whale ratio hit 0.64, which is actually the highest we've seen since 2015.
For the listener who might not track on-chain metrics daily, what exactly does an exchange whale ratio of 0.64 tell us?
So the whale ratio tracks the size of the top 10 incoming transactions to an exchange relative to total inflows.
Right.
When it spikes to 0.64, it means large entities are moving massive amounts of supply onto exchanges to sell. These are the legacy whales.
Like the really early adopters.
Right, we're talking about early cypherpunks and entities who accumulated coins for practically nothing a decade ago. They are distributing their holdings, essentially cashing out into this geopolitical fear premium.
But if the original whales are dumping massive supply on the market, why didn't the price absolutely tank? Who is absorbing all those coins?
That is where the institutional ETF flows come into play. We saw consecutive days of massive price-agnostic inflows.
Strategy Inc. was buying heavily.
Yeah, Strategy Inc. alone bought $1.1 billion worth of Bitcoin. BlackRock and Fidelity were just relentlessly soaking up the distributed supply.
Although we did see a brief window where $129 million flowed out of the ETF, so it wasn't purely a one-way street.
No, it wasn't. And the outflow is actually the most revealing part of the data. It highlights the dichotomy between tactical tourists and apex fiduciaries.
What's the difference there?
Traditional hedge funds using the ETFs tactically decided to de-risk and raise fiat cash when the Middle East panic hit. They treated Bitcoin like a high-beta, risk-on tech stock.
Oh, okay.
But the fiduciaries, the corporate treasuries like Strategy Inc., they didn't blink. They utilize a price-agnostic accumulation strategy. They are absorbing the coins from the legacy whales because they view the asset as a mandatory sanctuary from the exact debt-driven inflation cycle we outlined earlier.
And here is where the story pivots from the immediate crisis to the long-term reality. While the spot price seesaws on the charts and macro traders are panicking over the Middle East, the foundational infrastructure for digital assets is quietly executing a permanent expansion behind the scenes.
Yeah, the plumbing of global finance is being overhauled as we speak.
The regulatory and technological shifts we are seeing are irreversible. Let's run through these developments.
Sure.
First, Morgan Stanley filed an amended S-1 for the Morgan Stanley Bitcoin Trust, the MSBT. But the crucial detail isn't just the filing itself. It's that they're reintroducing in-kind physical subscriptions and redemptions.
That's a massive shift.
Why is the shift from cash creation to in-kind such a big deal for institutional capital?
It fundamentally changes the tax and friction profile of the asset. Earlier ETFs were forced by regulators into a cash-only model.
Right.
That meant if an authorized participant wanted to create shares of the ETF, they had to sell their physical Bitcoin for fiat, trigger a taxable event, incur slippage, and then hand the cash to the issuer.
Which is incredibly inefficient.
Totally. In-kind means institutions can deliver physical Bitcoin directly in exchange for ETF shares and vice versa. It dramatically reduces execution risks and makes the vehicle infinitely more efficient for massive sovereign and pension capital to maneuver in and out of.
Then we saw the SEC entirely abandon its long-standing prohibition on distributed ledger technology in the equity markets.
This was huge news.
The approved rule SR Nasdaq Q 2025-072. This allows traditional securities, we're talking about standard Russell 1000 stocks, to trade as tokenized assets directly on the Nasdaq, operating 24/7.
24/7 equities, it's wild.
Does this move essentially mean the traditional 9-to-5 stock market is admitting its underlying plumbing is obsolete?
Without a doubt. Wall Street is aggressively domesticating cryptographic architecture because they recognize it is a mandatory upgrade for survival.
Right, the old systems are just too slow.
The legacy system relies on T+1 or T+2 settlement. When you buy a stock on a Tuesday, the actual underlying ownership doesn't settle and clear until Wednesday or Thursday.
Which feels archaic now.
In a high-inflation, high-velocity financial world, trapping capital in settlement limbo for 48 hours is a massive systemic risk. They need the instant, cryptographically verifiable settlement that blockchain provides.
And we saw further validation of that when Mastercard agreed to acquire the stablecoin infrastructure provider BVNK for $1.8 billion.
Exactly.
The legacy payment networks clearly see that the future of cross-border remittance isn't going to run on the old correspondent banking system. It's going to run on cryptographic rails.
The financial layer is upgrading, but the physical infrastructure securing the network is also undergoing a fascinating evolution. The miners are actively adapting to the global energy shock.
Right, because with oil prices destroying operational margins, undercapitalized miners were forced to unplug their rigs. We saw the network difficulty adjust downward by 7.76%.
Yep, a significant drop.
But the enterprise-scale miners aren't just weathering the storm. They are completely pivoting their business models. HIVE Digital, for instance, is utilizing 300 megawatts of stranded hydroelectric energy down in Paraguay.
That's a brilliant move.
And they aren't just mining Bitcoin. They are powering high-margin artificial intelligence inference workloads alongside their mining operations.
That concept of stranded energy is vital. Hydroelectric power in Paraguay is abundant, but electricity degrades when you try to transmit it over long physical distances. You can't easily export the power.
It just gets lost in the grid.
Right. But a mining rig or an AI server farm allows you to instantly monetize that trapped energy and export the value globally over the internet. They are turning geographic isolation into a massive economic advantage.
And the adaptation goes even further than South America. StarCloud, a company backed by NVIDIA, just announced plans to launch Bitcoin mining ASICs into orbit.
Which brings us back to what we mentioned at the start, space mining.
Their thesis is that they can harness continuous interstellar radiation in space to achieve a better power-to-cost ratio than anything available on Earth-based grids. We are literally preparing to shoot digital asset infrastructure into the vacuum of space to escape fiat inflation and terrestrial energy blockades.
It sounds like pure science fiction, but it is grounded in ruthless economic rationalism.
When you break it down, it makes perfect sense.
It does. When terrestrial energy logistics break down due to kinetic warfare blockades and soaring insurance premiums, the mining infrastructure naturally seeks out environments where energy is continuous and state-level censorship is impossible. Space is simply the ultimate stranded energy frontier.
So, as we pull all these threads together, why does this matter to you listening? The world is rapidly abandoning theoretical financial models and crashing headfirst into undeniable physical realities.
You can't hide from the physical supply chain.
You cannot print a barrel of oil. You cannot mathematically algorithm your way out of a physically blockaded strait. And central banks cannot fake cryptographic scarcity.
Right.
Understanding how unbudgeted debt monetization, global kinetic energy shocks, and decentralized assets interact is your shortcut to being genuinely well-informed. You don't have to be reactive to every terrifying headline when you understand the underlying mechanics driving the system.
And that leads to a critical question I want to leave you to mull over.
What's that?
We just broke down how traditional Wall Street is actively building the plumbing to trade tokenized stocks 24/7 on a blockchain.
Yeah.
If that infrastructure is now fully approved, audited, and operational, what happens when a sovereign nation, one that is tired of the fiat paradox and debt monetization, decides to tokenize its own sovereign bonds or its physical commodities directly on a decentralized network?
Oh, wow. That changes everything.
The collision between legacy finance and cryptographic truth isn't ending. It is just getting started.
That is a fascinating geopolitical scenario to consider for the future. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive analysis. That's it for the week that was. We will catch you next time.